Right. So, feet hip width apart and check your stance. Feet parallel, weight a little bit forwards. Lifting your hips, drop back, and looking for that very loose quality initially. It's particularly important in all the joints of the body. It's particularly difficult, I think, for hips, knees, and ankles, because of course they're what we think of as weight-bearing joints. I prefer to think of them as weight transmitting. No. So it's difficult. We can't just loosen the joints and expect to stay upright. We can, of course, through loosening the joints, sink our center of gravity to root down better. And that helps to take the pressure off everything in the body, because the lower your center of gravity, the more stable we are. The less weight is above joints like the knees. You sink and get that sense of your center of gravity dropping that low. But even then, we need some kind of structure, some kind of replacement for the loss of that support from the joints. So I had somebody trying to get in then. I don't know where they've gone. Oh, she's on that. She's on her way. So what we want to do is look for a structure where the weight of the body that remains is evenly distributed. Our legs will always take a greater proportion than, say, our shoulders, hopefully. So the muscles of legs, lower back and around the hips, buttocks, need time to build up. We first feel it in the quadriceps at the front of the thighs. But if you think about the structure of the legs, you've got muscles here, here, and on the inside, on the outside, and down similarly in the calves. And the way muscles work is they're always paired. So when we flex the knees, there's a bit of an extension in the quadriceps, a contraction in the hamstrings. It's a simplification, but roughly speaking. So what we want to do is to find a balance between those, so they've both got an even sort of pull on them. And that idea is repeated right through the whole body, and not just in muscles, but tendons, ligaments, the fascia. So that if we think about the term balance in Tai Chi, rather than sort of like thinking of balancing on one leg or something like that, try and think of it in terms of a balance of efforts, shall we say, between different parts of the body, and particularly between those opposite parts of the body, front, back, sides, up and down, so on and so forth. So eventually you get to a point where you feel as though you're held in this position, a bit like, we call it being suspended, so a bit like you're suspended in a harness. What I sometimes imagine it would be like to be in a kind of parachute harness or something like that, or a baby in a baby bouncer. So that you're supported, and that means that the joints themselves, the spaces between the bones, retain their loose quality. And then gradually, using an image like moving through water, we build those alternative connections. Having taken the strain off the joint, we then want to feel that anything that happens in the body, or whichever part of the body it happens in, is connected through the whole body in one way or another. So if you're used to this exercise, you may notice that the very act of turning shifts your weight very, very slightly. When I turn to my right, there's just a slight increase in the pressure in my right leg. And then I go back to the left. Not enough to make the weight move at this point, but almost like the prelude to the movement, and so on and so forth. So when we turn in the middle here, not only are the arms affected, but legs and feet are affected and are part of the movement. So we begin to get that sense of the whole body in movement, the whole body engaged. As we become more aware of that, again, the image of moving through water, that slight resistance definitely helps with that. Then not only do we get the physical connections strengthening up, but we become more aware of that. And that awareness cultivates further connection. So this is an ongoing process. And through all the sense of the movement, the energy flowing. So these three elements, body, mind, and energy, interacting. And then raising your arms. Trying to keep the movement in your knees to a minimum. So this will be the tendency. And if you just push your knees forwards a bit, well, sink your hips back actually is probably a better way of thinking of it. You'll see that helps them to stay in position. And then as you turn, you begin to get this sense of just a movement outward. So this will happen and we rotate the knee out, and this will happen and we rotate the knee out. So that gradually that movement becomes very minimal. It will still be there a little bit. Some people would rather push their knee forwards. It amounts to the same thing. We'll get a little bit of stretching on the inside of the leg, a little bit of contraction on the outside of the leg. And again, that's something that does take a little bit of time to build up. And shake out. Swaying in the river. So easing forwards and backwards, just letting your arms hang by your sides for the moment. We want to be aware of that stopping point so that we don't fall forwards or backwards, but also aware, as the name suggests, that we're standing in water, maybe moving against the flow of the river. Just gradually imagine what it would be like. If you put your hand in a bowl of water and put it forwards, you'll feel the pressure of the water against the palm of your hand. And then if you swing it backwards, you'll feel the pressure of the water against the back of your hand. So there's a distinction between front and back. And as we do this, we can begin to sense that same change, that same distinction between the front and back of the whole body. So that's a very fluid quality and has as much to do with the momentum, the energy of the movement as it does with anything physical. But there will also be very, very small physical changes that begin to take place. So we gradually cultivate that feeling. What we want to try and do is to get to a point where we're no longer having to, if you like, get back and think, right, now I've got to push myself forward, now I've got to push myself back, and so on and so forth. But rather just reaching that point, our intent will change. We've gone back as far as possible. Now we want to go forwards. And all these various elements of the movement will begin to work together, guided by that intent. Again, that combination of body, mind, and energy. Then your hands coming into the movement. This is one of the ways we understand the idea of an internal art. One where the impetus for the movement comes from deeper inside the body. In fact, a point where it seems as though those three elements that I've described actually cease to exist as separate things, but rather body, mind, and energy are one thing. This is not as unusual as at first it sounds. If you decide at the end of the class that you're going to go and make a cup of tea, you'll just go and make a cup of tea. You'll pick up the kettle, you'll go to the tap, and so on and so forth. You won't have to think too much about the details of that, because the movement and the intent in your mind and the physical action will begin to work together. The intent will be guided by this image of the cup of tea that you want, and so on and so forth. So as we become more familiar with the movements and those processes, it feels perfectly natural for these three things to interact in that way. Remember, there's a neutral point where that sense of sort of, you know, the muscles front and back, for instance, are equal rather than stretched on one side and strained and contracted on the other. And for people with more experience, you'll probably, hopefully, find that you can find that neutral point by bringing your weight just behind the balls of your feet, and at the same time letting your hips drop back. That will change as you move forwards and backwards, because when we move forwards here, there's a certain amount of tilting and change in the pelvis that stops you falling forwards, and vice versa. You can hardly see it. In fact, you probably can't see it at all, but see if you can feel it. So in that neutral point, everything reaches this state of what we refer to as equilibrium in Tai Chi. So next time you come forwards, see if you can just rest there. Let your hips drop back, bring your hands around so you're holding the ball, and then pushing up and sinking down. So now the change in the body is a vertical one rather than a horizontal one. And again, feel the slight changes in the pelvis and so on and so forth. Don't push them, don't create them. If I, for instance, as I sink down, deliberately tighten my lower back, you can see what's happening. I'm being pulled backwards and so on and so forth. If I pull my belly in, same thing will happen. So to allow these small movements to take place, what we focus on is creating the structure, the environment within which they can happen. We try and remove the obstructions rather than strain to create the movement. For me, this process works well under the label cultivation. And although I'm no gardener, I know enough about growing things to know that actually we don't grow them. We let them grow themselves, and we make sure that the environment that they're in is conducive to that growth. Don't get so caught up with the legs that you forget about what the arms are doing. When we change to the wild goose, we can very quickly find that the muscles of our upper arm start to ache. And of course, what happens is here, this is the topmost position. It's not this, with the elbow rigid and the shoulder rigid. But again, the joints loose. Again, that means that certain muscles in the arms are going to work harder. Just recognize that, but focus mainly on this image of the bird in flight. If the aching in your arms or your legs or whatever comes too much, then you must, of course, rest. Stop and shake out. Rest for as long as you need to. The muscle, when it gets tired, ceases to function. So it's better to rest and let the muscle recover, which it will probably do fairly quickly, than it is to continue to strain, because that just means you'll go back to the old way of standing and moving. Now, heart in the clouds. Still that image of moving through water. So that idea, if you like, of moving into the resistance means that, for instance, here, as our arms come up, the little finger edge of the arm is pushing against the water, the thumb is following. But now as the hands turn, that changes. So we can observe these changes in the body as the images program the movement. And then that helps to make us a lot more aware of this internal quality, the movement, the energy, whatever label you care to put on it, really. One more time. And then dragon plucks the stars from the sky. Pushing up from the ground, feeling the expansion through one side. Let the fingers around, rotate. So you're plucking an apple off a tree. Drawing down. So again, we can use different images to help to develop our intent around this movement. You could, for instance, an image I quite like. Imagine you're standing on a big elastic band and you've got hold of it in one hand, and what you're going to do is push up against the resistance of the elastic band, and when your hand comes down, you're not going to let it snap down, you're just going to let it go slowly. Alternatively, for the downward movement, you could imagine plucking the apple off the tree. You have to pull a little bit hard. And that has the additional element that it has this rotation at the top of the movement. That is also quite a strong movement. So internal strength is what we're building. And we can feel that sometimes reflected in the quality of the movement. One more on each side. And then both hands. And just do the upward and the sideways movement, don't do the turning just yet. So we could use those same images, or imagine moving through water. And that internal change that I'm talking about, start off with when we look for the very loose quality. I would liken it to the feeling of a very soft breeze blowing over your skin. As it begins to develop that sense of internal strength, it has a slightly denser but still very fluid quality, so more like water flowing over your skin. And that's an internal change we can begin to recognize. And in the recognition again, it becomes, if you like, a part of our intent. So this internal strength builds up through the whole of the body, the whole of the movement. This time we'll add the turning movements. So the movement itself gets stronger. The body conditions and gets stronger in some very subtle ways. The intent gets stronger. And those three things, I would say, when they start to work together in the way that I described, it's actually as good an understanding of the idea of the chi as any I can think of at the moment. So you could say that over a period of time, the chi develops. So that's looking at the notion of the chi as something more than just energy, which is quite a common understanding, quite a common translation of it. But in this particular context, better to think of those three elements combined as one. Notice as we go through the different exercises when and where you lose the movement. So with this one, for instance, very simple exercise, easy to follow on, but quite easy to get it wrong, particularly in the turning sections. If you simply twist your shoulders around like this, you'll probably get a sort of straining in your back. So we have to move from that middle part of the body, hips and waist, and let shoulders and arms follow the movement, maintaining the alignment of the body as we do. That can be very, very difficult. And quite often I find that an exercise like this that I've been doing for decades really is suddenly, oh, it's not working. There's something blocking up there somewhere along the line. and then changing again, circling palms. So as you become familiar with the sequence, and this is one of the reasons why we deal in sequences in Tai Chi, why we always start these exercise classes with the same sequence, because it allows the mind, it allows the intent to know what is coming. So the change, in one sense, has its source in the change of intent. And then, if it's comfortable, add in the turn. Switch sides. The more familiar you are with the exercise, the more you'll find that internalization taking place. If this one is one that you remember well, you'll remember the expansion outwards from the side of your body, pushing your arm out, for instance. And of course, that's going to vary from person to person, vary in each individual, from exercise to exercise. Again, if it's comfortable, add the turn. Okay, just let your arms rest for a moment. Go back to the sinking down and pushing up. Shoulders in line with your hips. Now, I've been talking a great deal about opposite movements, balancing movements, looking for the movement that counterbalances what we see, if you like. And for the next two exercises, the main thing here is going to be the hips going back. So I pivot on the legs. And then to come back to the upright, let the hips drop down again. So sink down, dropping the center of gravity. If I didn't do this pivoting movement, in other words, if my hips didn't go back, then what would happen is this. I just go forwards and I will fall over. And then for the second of these exercises, there's going to be the pivoting, but also the turning from side to side when we do polishing the table. Again, if all I do is lean forwards and tilt over, I'm going to fall over. So it's very important that you get these movements and that you're very careful with your arms until you really feel that you've got that opposite movement. So rowing a boat in the middle of the lake. So that internal awareness should be reliable, should tell you when you've got to a point where you shouldn't go any further. We become very sensitive to what's happening within the body. We're not stretching. We're trying to keep that unity of body, mind, and movement. We're trying to keep the energy flowing. And any tightening is going to reduce that flow. Do one more of these. Then we're going to switch to polishing the table. So from here, we come to the upright position. We turn, push the hips back and around. Hands just staying at hip height. And if they were really on a slippery table, a sliding table, they'd get pushed forwards at this point. Behind, you can see my hips moving around. Really, that movement in the hips is something that we always want to feel, regardless of the exercise, but not often to an extent where we actively see it in this way. One more in each direction. And then just rest. Shake out. So when, for instance, we do this opening exercise here, it's almost like we're doing this. This will be slightly ridiculous, by the way, but it's almost like we're doing this. And we can feel that, and you may even see it a little bit with that particular exercise, but it shouldn't be very big at all. And I sometimes think it's almost like somebody's taken hold of my belt and just kind of pulled me there, and then pulled me there, and pulling around. It's not the only factor in the movement by any means, because we also want to get this sense of the movement in the front of the body, but it helps to spread out the intent. And so when the intent spreads through the rest of the body, and we become aware of these opposite movements and these other areas of engagement, shall we call them, in the body, then we once again begin to develop them. A good example of this, let's do the exercise swimming dragon. So remember, this is quite a strong exercise. If you'd rather do it with your feet hip width apart, that's fine. And it's interesting because we do the sideways movement. So here, what I'm doing is, if you look at my hands, I'll come a bit closer. I'm going to start with my feet hip width apart, but then I will move to the side. But there, you can see this hand is going down, this hand is going up, which means that my pelvis is tilting from side to side. I'm exaggerating this, but what you can also see now is my knees moving a little bit from side to side. So we're looking for a curve down through the body, and then it straightens up, and then it curves in this direction. Again, this is normally much smaller, so I'm just trying to describe something that you wouldn't normally see. When my feet go together, you'll see it much more in the knees. Very, very careful. This is, even if I do this, I can feel quite a lot of movement in my spine. So might even try different ranges of movement with these exercises. Sometimes small, sometimes big. And then your hands lightly pressed together, wrists flexing and extending. Be particularly careful with your knees here. It's not always obvious what's happening, I think, in some of these exercises with the knees. The knees have a certain amount of sideways movement, as does the spine, but those are quite limited, I think. So we've got these three areas of the body: the lower dantian between hip and waist, middle dantian between solar plexus and heart, upper dantian between upper chest and head. And we're going to make circles around them. So drop down, see how whether you can get your hands down below your belly. Don't bend forwards to do that. And then between waist and solar plexus and across roughly the throat. Those areas that I've given you for the 3 dantians are very approximate. We're thinking about 3 regions of the body, rather than, as is sometimes the case when people talk about the dantians, 3 points in the body. When we're thinking of those regions, we want to feel them as a natural quality of the body. So we want to feel that, you know, there are these segments, connected segments within the body. There's not a hard boundary, I think, between them. Our body doesn't divide easily into upper and lower, middle, left and right, whatever. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. And then the other way. And you'll find if you read around this subject a bit, depending on the context, there will be different locations, slightly different locations. Lower, middle, and upper are good enough for this exercise. In Chinese medicine, those 3 regions are sometimes referred to as the triple heater, and they're regarded as an organ, but really they're much more a collection of areas of the body, very much concerned with the overall sense of the regulation of movement, action within the body. And we can feel very clearly the significance of the hips. So the lower dantian is the one regarded as primary one, often referred to simply as the dantian. Some people don't bother with the upper and lower business. And shake out. So a sense of regulating the body, the temperature, the movements, the actions within the body, all come under the province of what is sometimes referred to as the triple heater in Chinese medicine. Okay, so one foot forwards. So this area of the body, the lower dantian, just simply the dantian, is primary. It's where the energy is said to be stored. It is almost invariably the point where the energy is grounded. So in the sort of Taoist yogas, where they work with the different levels of energy and so on and so forth, there's always a sense in which you come back to this each time. It's where all regions of the body meet, upper, lower, left, right, all into this area here. So when we're talking about, as we do in Tai Chi, the whole of the body moving as one, this becomes, to use a quote from the Tai Chi class, it's like the hub of a wheel. So when we do this exercise, one way of thinking of it is, for instance, it's like you've got a big ball here that goes from your belly down to the floor. And what happens is the ball rolls forwards, and when the ball rolls forwards, your weight moves, and when the ball rolls back, your weight moves. And that can be quite interesting, because you might find that you're moving less when you do that, which is fine. It can also be quite a good way to change your view of the movement and to take some of the effort off out of the knees. If you just think of going forwards, you might do this, and you can see my knee is overextended. But if this is rolling forwards, then there's quite a lot happening, so you don't need quite so much distance involved. When you go back, there should be no more than 70% of your weight in the back leg. When you go forwards, no more than 60. Maybe not even that much. So a shift of maybe 10 to 20% of your weight is all we're talking about. Now we change that because we go back and you just raise your toes a little bit. Make sure you don't come up, but actually soften down through your hip, leg, knee, and so on. Allow more of the weight to drop down. Turn the front foot out very slightly. Now let the back knee bend and the heel come up. So rather than this, see my head going up, what you should feel is that as the toes come up, it's almost like it's going down further. Probably won't be, but that's how it feels. Center of gravity gets lower. You begin to get a sense of being able to align yourself over the supporting leg. I make it as much as now, maybe 80% of my weight here. I'm looking for a straight line down there, not this, or this, or oops, nearly bent over then, or this, or whatever. Same thing here. So my weight has a clear passage down into the ground. And that's when I can begin to take the step. I'll bring the foot in. And even as I bring the foot in, there's a slight extra shift because now, of course, 100% of the weight is on the supporting leg. Those of you familiar with this, you can make that alignment very precise. The weight is just behind the ball of the foot, on the midline of the foot. On that, using that image of the acupuncture point, the bubbling well that's just behind the ball of the foot, as a sort of sinkhole for the weight to flow down. And you want to try and feel that corresponding point in the crown of your head, in the fontanelle, the soft spot of the baby, is sort of in line with that point. Whether it's actually physically in line or not is difficult to say, because obviously our bodies have all sorts of curves and so on and so forth. But you want to feel that there's a connection there. And then on the other side. So those points in the body can become like reference points on a map or landmarks when we're out for a walk. They help us to orientate our awareness within the inner landscape of the body. And when we've got that orientation, once again, we come back to the idea that we can move more freely. And then again, raising your toes and your heel. Take your time. Really give yourself time for that settling process. When you're ready, bring the foot in. You might want to just put the foot down. They do this in Sun style Tai Chi. They call it a following step. So this doesn't have to be an exercise in being able to stand on one leg. You may find that every now and then that you're able to do that. But it's also fine just to put the foot down. And then whichever direction you have the space to take a few steps forwards. When you do this, remember your heel goes down, then your toes, and then your weight. Opposite way round if you're walking backwards, of course. Now I'm going to go back, and when I feel back, it's the ball of my foot goes down, then the heel. May help you to remember that idea of just gently pushing into the ground with the foot before you move away. Well, in a few moments, we would do Wind Blows the Willows, which I think is familiar to most of you. And see if you find it helpful to think again in terms of what's happening here. So that as I go into this, I'm turning to my left and my arms are coming up. But this part of the body where the spine meets the pelvis is going to do the opposite. It's going to go down and to the right. So again, it's not the whole story. But if we can change our perspective, we enlarge our perspective on the movement. So it might suit you to think of doing that. But we're going to start with fisherman castanet. We don't have to practice like this all the time. There are times when we can just sit back and let the movement happen. And I find that when I'm working with an idea like this opposite movement, or what's happening in the knees or whatever, I find that I will focus on it for a while, maybe over a few days or a few weeks, maybe just for a few minutes. But there always comes a point where I feel myself sitting back, and again, it's like I've going back to that idea of exploring a landscape. It's like I've lifted my head up from the map. I'm now actually looking at the whole landscape. And change to pushing a wave. And then Wind Blows the Willows. So if this is comfortable for you, you can begin to raise your heel and your toes in the way that we did before. But don't lose that sense of what's happening in the center of your body, turning and sinking. and then step in. Try not to rush this. You step, the heel goes down, the toes, you push in a little bit. And you may even find, you know, if you practice that sort of pressing in of the foot, it's very gentle, just allowing the sole of the foot to relax. It's quite natural when you've done that to feel that your weight then begins to follow on. And shake out. The other foot forwards, starting with wind blows the willows. If that idea of sort of pushing the foot in appeals to you, you don't have to do it just when you take a step. So I sink back, and now I want to go forward. It's like I'm standing on soft sand, and I just gently push the front foot into the floor as though it can sink into the floor. And sometimes when I do that, I find that I don't have to sort of like then move the weight, because it's quite natural that my weight will follow on. Pushing away. And then turning. Again, if it's comfortable, raising your toes. And maybe stepping in. Good. And shake out. So I was saying earlier about how these things gradually become integrated and we become aware of, if you like, you know, as I described it, the whole landscape. And that stepping and the idea of the push in is a good example of that. I've been playing with that idea since I came across it properly about 3.5, 4 years or something like that. And to start off with, it was like, how am I supposed to do this? And I would just take a step, and it's like, well, how can I push in? It doesn't feel right, you know. I'm getting it wrong, but gradually I began to get a sense of, oh yeah, okay, so there's something happening there. But then as soon as I started bringing the arms into the movement, I lost that. But gradually over a period of time, I get the feeling that it's happening more and more within the movements themselves. And I think it's just time. And this is again what we cultivation. If you're growing whatever you're growing, you tell them a gardener, can't you? If you're growing something, it will grow in its own time. You can enhance the growing, you can enhance the environment, but in the end, you can take away the things that are stopping it from growing, or some of them at least. But it'll still take its own time to grow. And it's the same in Tai Chi. And it's useful to think in those terms, I think, with arts like this, that we're cultivating things rather than thinking, well, that's a good idea, I'll do that. It's not going to work like that. So just rubbing your hands together and tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Down on the shoulder. Arm. The other side. Your back. Around your hips. Legs. Right on your belly. The upper part. So one of the main things that we're constantly working on cultivating is the centering, the rooting, the sinking down, however you care to think about it. And again, this brings our attention back to this area of the lower down chin, returning to the mountain. So embrace tiger, return to the mountain, sink down, pushing up. And you may even find as you push up and out that you get a bit wobbly or stiffen up in some places or whatever. But there's just this natural rhythm and quality that brings us back to the center, back to the mountain. And then we can start again. One more time. And stand. Lovely. Thank you very much. As always, I hope that was useful to you. You can all go off and enjoy this. I think there's a little bit of sunshine out there. We live around here anyway, so hope.
Thank you very much, Mike, as usual. Excellent.
Thank you.